Okay, having done my job now for over 5 years, there are a few things that I feel come up quite a lot, and I feel like I can address them fairly fast. But these are just things that come up in my life, in my job, and things that I want to address. Myth number one, cardio. Now, cardio is definitely not a myth. Cardio definitely works and is great for cardiovascular health, for fitness, and it can be a tool used in fat loss. The point I'm making is when people embark on a dieting phase, they believe that they need to do mountains of cardio to drop body fat. In fact, they believe that it is the most effective and potentially the only way to lose body fat. It's not the case. You do not have to be doing mountains of cardio from day one. In fact, you can introduce it over time. In fact, I'd even argue that you don't have to do it. And if you truly enjoy cardio, fantastic, but I'm just here to say that it doesn't have to be cardio and fuck tons of it from day one. Myth number two, again, salad is definitely a thing and tastes pretty good, to be honest, but a lot of people assume that as soon as you start dieting, it must mean salads for every meal. I'm sure you probably heard it, like I know I heard it. I remember I used to work in offices myself, and it was like as soon as someone was dieting, they just immediately assumed that everything had to be a salad. And if it wasn't a salad, if it was any form of starchy carb or just carbs in general, they would just immediately assume that carbs meant fat gain and salads meant fat loss. In fact, you don't need to eat salad at all, unless you really like the taste of it, but you definitely do not need to just rely on salads to lose weight. Now, how many of you rely solely on the scales and you assume that if the scales have gone up, that must mean that you've put on body fat? Or for a lot of males, if the scales have gone up, that must mean that you've put on pure muscle mass. And then similarly the other way around as well. So if the scales have gone down, that must mean that you've lost muscle mass. Actually, I'm here to say that's definitely not the truth. Scales are actually very much affected by a lot of things. So number one would be water. So what happens when you start reducing carbohydrate intake or increasing carbohydrate intake? By carbohydrate's very nature, they store water. So when you start increasing carbohydrate intake, the amount of water that your body holds will increase. So you can sometimes see the scales go up, but that doesn't mean you've put on body fat. Similarly, on the way down, if you were to reduce carbohydrates, it is very possible that you can see the scales moving down fairly fast. That doesn't mean that you've lost weight as fast as the scales are necessarily implying. Scales are affected by numerous things: stress, sleep, digestion, bowel movements, water, all sorts of things. In fact, you can right now go and drink a litre of water and you've put on a kilogram of body weight. Relying too heavily on the scales is a mistake. That doesn't mean that they're not handy and they're not useful as a guide. They're not to be relied upon too heavily as they are affected by so many external factors. Now, this one has been very poignant for me in my life, 16, 17, and just assuming that that was the way it was. Low weight, high rep, tones muscle. But if you really want to build muscle, it means you have to go high weight, low rep. That's just not how hypertrophy works. Hypertrophy is based on time under tension, accumulative volume lifted throughout the week, how the muscle is actually functioning. So for example, you can perform a movement, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're connecting with the movement. An example of that would be a power lifter. Someone who's moving the weight from A to B, but they're not strictly thinking about how the muscle is functioning and how the muscle is being used. Getting caught up in these numbers too heavily is a bit of a mistake. So when you're thinking about toning a muscle, what's actually happening is you're just dropping body fat, which is largely dependent on the diet. To build muscle, once again, it's very, very heavily dependent on the diet. And if you're not eating enough, you simply won't grow, regardless of your rep range and regardless of the load lifted. It's about the whole equation: training, diet, rest over time. It's not about one thing in specific. So instead of thinking about this too much, think about how the muscle is functioning through the movement, think about your diet, and think about how much recovery you've got over the course of a week, month, year. I don't mean to pigeonhole too much, but this one is definitely aimed more towards females. Very, very often, females get caught up in thinking that if they start lifting weights, they're gonna look like Arnold Schwarzenegger. I just wish life was that sweet, because I've been lifting weights for 15 plus years now and I'm still not quite at his level, It's definitely not something that just happens by accident. You don't do one or two too many reps or one too many bench presses or squats and all of a sudden become bulky. Remember what I said before, everything is based on the whole pie rather than just one specific piece within it. So it's about your recovery, your rest, and your training style over a long period of time. Things don't just happen at the blink of an eye. So Weights definitely do not make you bulky, and you don't have to rely on cardio to tone. You can use weights to build muscle, to drop body fat over time in accordance with a solid diet. There's a lot of people are putting emphasis on 6-week bulks, 6-week cuts and things like that because they want it to be snappy.
It says cuts and bulks take longer than you realise. That's not a myth, that's true. You just change what you've written on the board.
So we live in an Instagram age where everything is immediate and we want results yesterday. But the reality is things take longer than we realise. The kind of physiques that you and I admire have taken years to build. Now, don't get me wrong, if you start from a fairly lean position and if you've been training for a long period of time, it's absolutely possible to get pretty decent results in 6 weeks. But for the vast majority of the population, this just isn't reality. Things take time. Things take way longer than you and I realise. So, if you're going to embark on a 6-week cut, understand that if you're not in a lean position, you're probably not going to get exactly where you want to be. Now, that is dependent on your subjective opinion of what a shred is. It's dependent on your training experience, it's dependent on your start position, and it depends on your adherence. Similarly, when going up, when people want to do a 6-week bulk, I would argue that this is absolutely not possible. Growing muscle is probably the slowest process that there is. If you want to gain significant amounts of muscle, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 10 weeks is probably not enough. Even as a newbie, when progression happens way faster, things are going to take time, and allowing yourself such short periods of time to achieve things that you really want is not really realistic for the vast majority of people. Now, don't get me wrong, you can absolutely progress in 6 weeks. 100% you can progress in 6 weeks. I'm just trying to say that things need to be realistic. And I guess I'm just here to say that realistically, things typically take longer. If you want to get an extreme result, or if you want to change your body dramatically, things typically take longer than 6 weeks. And I want to finish with steroids. Everyone's favorite subject. Whether I like it or not, people love focusing on steroids. They put so much emphasis on steroids. If you want to cut, the amount of times in fact, let me say, the amount of times I've had this question in my inbox. All right, mate, what steroids do I need to cut? This is one of the most common questions that people ask. The fastest way to cut is through dieting. There is no steroid that will make you cut faster than dieting well. That's not to say that there aren't certain steroids that have a propensity to build muscle better than others. If you are not dieting correctly in accordance with your goal, none of this matters. So for example, Dianabol, D-bol, known as a bulking steroid, or DECA is typically known as a bulking steroid. If you're in a caloric deficit, giving yourself plenty of time, you're going to be cutting. You're not going to be bulking. This whole thing about one being a cutting and one being a bulking steroid is basically just bullshit. These things are amplifiers to what you're already doing. So if you're cutting or you're bulking and you introduce steroids, they're going to amplify your results. There's no question about that. But they do have different anabolic ratings and they do have different androgenic ratings. However, diet. 26 weeks of dieting with COVID putting the shows back. Oh, I'm so fucked. I've got to train now and I've got fuck all energy. I'm trying to smile and I feel bad for Amy who has to put up with me and my grumpiness. I'm actually filming this now as well. Thank you. So I feel great.